He was the last to clock out, after 42 years, but what was waiting at the door broke him. Jim Caldwell walked through the factory one last time, his boots heavy on the worn concrete floor. The clock had just ticked over to 5, and the steady hum of machines was winding down, as if the place itself was ready to breathe a sigh of relief. His final shift. After 42 years, this was the moment. But it didn't feel like anything special. The walls of the factory were the same, gray, chipped, with decades of sweat and oil embedded in their surface. Nothing had changed, except him, and he wasn't sure what to make of that. The day had been quiet. The farewell party earlier had been brief, nothing more than a handshake and a few well-meaning words that Jim didn't really understand. He wasn't sure what people expected him to feel. The pride of a man who had worked his entire life, the joy of freedom at last. He felt none of it. Instead, there was a hollow echo in his chest, a question he couldn't answer. What now? He walked past the assembly line, past the men who had worked with him for years, now gone to their homes, leaving the factory to fall into an almost unnatural stillness. There was a dull ache in his legs as he moved, but it was nothing compared to the ache he felt somewhere deeper. It had been like this for the last few weeks, this creeping feeling that he was slipping away from something familiar, something that had defined him for so long. A factory, a place, a job. These were the things Jim had built his life around, but now they were slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to hold on. Before he knew it, the factory floor had emptied, the lights dimming one by one as the final few workers filtered out the door. He was alone now, standing in the middle of a place he'd spent most of his life. His eyes wandered over to the break room, where the familiar scent of coffee and fried food lingered in the air, even though it had been hours since anyone had been in there. It was a room full of quiet voices, laughter, arguments, and everything in between. A place that had felt like home for years, where he had sat with friends and colleagues, shared his lunch, and listened to their stories. A room that felt so empty now. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Jim pushed the door open. The factory parking lot stretched out in front of him. He got in his car and sat down behind the wheel, but the seat felt almost too big for him. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to be now. The sun had barely set when Jim pulled into his driveway. His house was small, modest, just like everything else in his life had been. The place where he had spent decades, building a life and raising a family. He had spent the better part of 42 years working for the future, always thinking there would be a time when he could rest, when he could enjoy what he had built. But now that future had come, and he didn't know what to do with it. He sat in the car for a few minutes. He thought of his wife, Linda, the way she would have greeted him when he came home from a long day's work. She had always been there, waiting, with a smile and a warmth that made the world outside fade into the background. But tonight, she wasn't there. Jim hadn't been able to bring himself to tell her about his retirement. Inside, the house was as it always was. The kitchen light was still on, the faint smell of last night's dinner lingering in the air. The radio played softly from the other room, and Jim could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. But even the familiar sounds didn't bring him the comfort they once did. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just listening, letting the weight of the silence settle in around him. And then he saw it. The small table by the door, the place where Linda had always kept her things. But tonight, there was something different. A small envelope lying on top of the table. Jim froze. The envelope was unfamiliar. He reached for it. There was no return address, no name on the front, just his own name, written in a neat, steady hand that he didn't recognize. He tore the envelope open, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The letter inside was short, just a few lines of text, but the words hit him harder than he could have imagined. It was a farewell letter from the men he had worked alongside for decades. The ones who had come and gone, some of them retired, some of them moved on, and some of them lost to time. Jim's eyes scanned the letter. It was a thank you, a note of appreciation for the man he had been to them, a recognition of his quiet strength, his steady presence, and his unwavering dedication. A thank you for simply being there. And as Jim read those words, he realized he had been a part of something, a part of their lives, their stories. And now, as the last man standing, he realized the factory had never been the same without him. Jim sat at the kitchen table, the letter still clutched in his hands. The recognition felt late, but also, in some ways, just in time. His eyes drifted over the rest of the room. The house was quiet. It was an uncertain kind of quiet, like the world outside was waiting for him to make a move, to decide what came next. He set the letter down on the table and stood up. There was a sense of finality in the air now. The factory, the job he had spent his entire adult life at, was no longer his. 42 years of his life spent in that factory, working his way through the routines, the shifts, the grind. And now, it was over. But there was no sense of triumph, no feeling of release, only the strange weight of being untethered, of being free, but unsure of where to go. The phone on the wall rang, cutting through the silence like a sudden sharp note. Jim jumped, startled by the unexpected sound. He reached for the receiver, his heart pounding for no reason at all. "Hello?" "Jim." The voice on the other end was familiar but distant. It was one of his old co-workers, Mike, the man who had sat next to him on the factory floor for more years than Jim cared to count. "How you doing, old man?" Jim cleared his throat. "I'm all right. Just getting settled in." "I bet that's a lot harder than you thought, huh?" Mike's laugh was a low chuckle. "Hell, I remember when I retired. Thought I was going to be out on a beach somewhere, sipping beers in the sun. Instead, I'm sitting here, trying to figure out what to do with myself. It ain't easy, is it?" Jim smiled. "No, it's not. Guess I thought I'd have it all figured out by now." A silence that hung in the air. Then Mike spoke again, quieter this time. "I don't know if you ever really figure it out, Jim. You just do your best to make peace with what comes. You've earned it, man. You gave that place everything you had. You were the heart of it." The conversation shifted after that, and Jim let the words drift around him without really listening. The familiar banter, the small talk. It all felt distant, like he was hearing it from somewhere far away. He was grateful for it, grateful for the connection, but it didn't fill the empty space that was growing in his chest. He ended the call a few minutes later. It was done. The factory was behind him. His past was behind him, and all that was left was what he made of it, what he was going to do next. He walked through the house, his steps slow, almost deliberate, as he took in the rooms he had walked through for so many years. The worn couch in the living room, the coffee table where he'd spent countless nights sitting with Linda, watching TV after a long day. The pictures on the walls, faded over time but still there, holding memories of a life lived together. His eyes lingered on one picture in particular. It was a photograph from their first vacation, before the kids had come along, when life had felt lighter. He could almost hear Linda's laughter in the background, could almost feel the weight of her hand in his. And just like that, he was back in the past. The memories washed over him, and for a moment, he wasn't the man who had just retired. He was the man who had lived a life with her, a life they had built together, brick by brick, shift by shift. The life that had seemed like it would last forever. But things had changed. She was gone now, and he was alone in this house. Jim sat down in his favorite chair, the one by the window, and stared out at the darkness outside. The world seemed so big now, so wide, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure where he fit into it. Jim didn't sleep well that night. The bed felt too big for him, the sheets too cool. He lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, the stillness pressing down on him. His mind kept turning over the same thoughts. The factory. The years spent working the same machines, the same hours, the same faces. And now, all of it was behind him. He hadn't expected it to feel like this, not with the years of planning, the anticipation of freedom. But here he was, struggling to find peace in the silence. The house felt different without Linda's voice in it, without the smell of dinner cooking in the kitchen or the soft rustling of her papers as she sat at the table, working on whatever project she had going. The little things, the things that used to be background noise in his life, were now glaringly absent, and Jim didn't know how to fill that void. Jim sighed and pushed himself up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The familiar sounds of the house greeted him, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustling of the wind outside. But it all felt distant now, as though he was seeing everything through a fog. He made his way to the coffee pot, his hands moving on autopilot as he prepared the same cup of coffee he'd made for years. As he sat down at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around the mug, he found himself staring at the envelope from the night before. He picked up the letter, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper again. He read the words slowly, this time letting them sink in. The gratitude, the thanks, the recognition. It was all there, simple words but heavy with meaning. He hadn't expected it, hadn't realized just how much he had meant to those men, to the people he had worked alongside for so many years. It was strange to think about. He had never considered himself a leader, never thought of himself as someone who had made an impact. He had always just done his job, kept his head down, and worked. He had spent so many years focused on the work, on the routine, on the next shift, the next paycheck. But now, in the quiet of the morning, he was confronted with the realization that there was more to life than the work. But what was that? He didn't know. He couldn't remember the last time he had done something just for himself, something that wasn't tied to the factory or his family. He had spent so much of his life giving, doing for others, that he didn't know where to start when it came to doing something for himself. The next day came like a slow-moving river, its current soft but persistent, pulling Jim along in its wake. He woke up early, as he always did, the habit too ingrained to break. But there was no sense of urgency today, no factory to get to, no shift to clock into. Just a day that stretched out in front of him, a blank canvas he didn't know how to fill. Jim sat at the kitchen table again, staring at his cup of coffee, now lukewarm. The smell of it still lingered in the air, but it was a different kind of smell today, one that didn't carry the comfort it once did. He had spent so many years drinking his morning coffee in the quiet of the house, after Linda had left for work, after the kids had grown up and moved out. But today, it felt foreign. The house felt foreign. The silence was louder today than it had been yesterday. He had always been a man of action, a man who knew his place, his purpose. But now that purpose had vanished, and he was left to figure out what came next. After a long while, he stood up and moved toward the front door. He had no real plan, no destination in mind, but something in him told him to get out, to move. The factory was gone, but the world outside hadn't stopped turning. The street outside was quiet, just like the rest of the neighborhood. The houses lined up like old friends, the same as they always had been. He had walked these streets 1,000 times before. But today, he walked without purpose, his footsteps slow and unsure. He didn't know where he was headed, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was the feeling of motion, the rhythm of his feet hitting the pavement. Jim wandered aimlessly for what felt like hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky. His thoughts drifted between memories and uncertainty. He thought about the factory, about the years he had spent there, the men he had worked with. But most of all, he thought about Linda. It had been 3 years since she passed away, but there were days when it felt like it had just happened. She had been the one who always knew how to fill the silence, the one who had always known what to do. When she was gone, it felt like a part of him had gone with her. He had kept going, of course, kept working, kept living, but it wasn't the same. It never had been. Jim reached the park near the end of the block and sat down on a bench, looking out at the empty swings swaying gently in the breeze. The park had always been a place of quiet reflection for him, a place to gather his thoughts after a long day. But today, it was just another empty space, another reminder of the stillness that had crept into his life. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the wind through the trees wash over him. It was peaceful in its own way, but it wasn't enough. Nothing felt like enough anymore. That's when he noticed the envelope again. It was sitting on the bench beside him, just as it had been the day before. He had forgotten about it, the letter he had opened and read, but now it was there, a quiet presence, waiting for him to do something with it. Jim unfolded it once again. The words were still there, still as simple and as powerful as they had been the night before. A note of thanks, a note of recognition, a farewell from the men who had worked alongside him for all those years. For the first time in years, Jim felt something stir inside him, something that wasn't just the weight of the past or the uncertainty of the future. It was a sense of pride, a sense of belonging. He had been a part of something, and that something had mattered. He had made a difference. The feeling was strange, foreign even, but it was there. It wasn't something he could ignore, and it wasn't something he wanted to ignore. For the first time in a long time, Jim felt like he wasn't just a man lost in the quiet of his own home. He was a man who had given something of himself to others, a man who had left a mark, even if he hadn't known it. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. It wasn't a magic cure for everything that was wrong, but it was something. It was a reminder that he had lived a life that mattered, that the years he had spent at the factory hadn't been for nothing. Jim stood up from the bench and took a deep breath, the weight of the letter still in his pocket. He wasn't sure what to do next, but at least he knew that he didn't have to figure it out alone. He had the letter. He had his memories. And for the first time in a long time, he had a sense of what it meant to be seen, to be understood. The world around him hadn't stopped, but maybe, just maybe, he could start to see it again. And that, in itself, felt like a small victory. Jim woke up to the sound of birds outside his window, a light chorus that felt like a distant call to something he couldn't quite reach. He had been awake for a while, his mind turning over the events of the past few days, but this morning was different. The heaviness in his chest had lightened just a little, and for the first time since he retired, he felt like he might be able to breathe. The letter was still in his pocket. It had become a small, constant reminder of something he hadn't realized he'd been searching for, something he'd never even thought to look for: the acknowledgement, the recognition. He wasn't sure why it had hit him so hard, why the words of a few men he had worked beside had made such an impact. But they had. And now they were slowly pushing him towards something he hadn't expected. He stood up from the bed, his movements slow and deliberate. The house felt different this morning, warmer, even with the quiet that surrounded him. The silence, though still present, didn't feel as oppressive as it had before. Maybe it was the letter, maybe it was just the passing of time, but something inside him had shifted. He made his way to the kitchen, where the smell of coffee filled the air, the familiar scent of his morning routine. His hands moved on autopilot as he prepared the pot, the steady rhythm of the action grounding him, giving him a sense of purpose. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jim sat down at the table, the same chair he had sat in every morning for years. But today, he felt a little lighter, as though the weight of the previous days had started to slip away. It was as if the world had gently shifted, just enough for him to feel like he could step into it. His eyes wandered over to the envelope on the table, where it had been since he brought it inside. It still held the same weight, the same quiet presence that had kept him thinking for days. He hadn't looked at it again since that day in the park, but it had stayed with him. The words on that page had done something inside him that he couldn't quite explain. They had made him realize that he wasn't invisible, that he had mattered. He wasn't just a man who had worked his life away. He was a man who had made a difference. He unfolded the letter again, carefully, as though the paper might break if he wasn't gentle enough. The words were still there, still as simple and clear as they had been the first time. There was no grand speech, no elaborate declaration, just a simple thank you. But it wasn't the thank you itself that had gotten to him. It was the way it made him feel, the way it made him see his own life in a new light. For so long he had worked without thinking much of it, showing up every day, doing what he was asked, keeping his head down. It wasn't that he was ungrateful. He just never thought it would be enough to leave an impression. But the men who had worked beside him had seen something he hadn't. And that, in itself, was enough to make him stop, to make him reconsider everything he had thought about his life. He thought about the letter again, letting the words sink deeper into his mind. They weren't just a thank you. They were a reminder that he had been a part of something bigger than himself, that he had played a role in a story, in the lives of the men he had worked with, in a way he hadn't realized. Jim didn't know what he was supposed to do with that realization. He didn't know what the next chapter of his life was supposed to look like. But he knew one thing. He couldn't just sit here anymore. He couldn't let this new sense of awareness slip away, not after everything it had given him. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket again, a small piece of his past that he wasn't ready to let go of. He stood up from the table, his hands shaking just slightly as he reached for his jacket. The house, quiet and still, seemed to be waiting for him, as though it too was ready for something new. Jim grabbed his keys, walked out the door, and stepped into the cool morning air. The world outside was just beginning to wake up, the streets still empty, the sky still soft with the last remnants of dawn. He didn't know where he was going, but it didn't matter. He had the letter. He had his memories. And for the first time, he had a sense of purpose again. He walked down the street, each step feeling more sure than the last. It wasn't about finding answers. It was about moving forward, about letting go of the past, but holding on to the things that mattered. And maybe, just maybe, he would figure out the rest as he went. The morning passed in a blur. Jim found himself walking without a destination in mind, letting his feet guide him through the familiar streets. The world around him felt both unchanged and unfamiliar. The houses, the trees, the distant hum of traffic. They were all the same, yet they seemed distant, like scenes from a movie he couldn't quite place. His steps were slow, measured, but with purpose. For the first time since his retirement, he was moving through the world, not just watching it go by. He didn't know where he was headed, but it didn't matter. It wasn't the destination that was important. It was the act of moving, of stepping into the day. He had spent too many years defined by his work, by the hours, the shifts, the machines. But now, with the factory gone, with the years behind him, he was starting to realize something. He didn't have to be defined by that anymore. He wasn't just a worker. He was a man who had lived a life, who had built something, even if he hadn't known it at the time. Jim turned a corner and found himself at the edge of the park again, the same park he had walked through the day before. It seemed to call to him, the familiar swings swaying gently in the breeze, the soft rustle of leaves in the trees. He walked toward the bench where he had sat before, the same place where he had read the letter, the same place where he had felt the weight of it settle into his chest. He sat down slowly, his hands resting on his knees, and stared out at the empty park. The world around him was quiet, just as it had been yesterday, but something had changed inside him. He wasn't the same man who had walked out of the house that morning. He was different. The realization had come slowly, piece by piece, but now it was undeniable. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the letter again, unfolding it carefully. The words were still there, simple and straightforward, but they held more weight now than they had before. He read them again, letting the gratitude, the acknowledgement, sink deeper into his bones. He wasn't just a man who had worked at a factory for 42 years. He was a man who had made a difference. He thought about the men who had signed the letter. They weren't just names on a page. They were faces he had seen every day for years, faces he had shared the quiet moments with, the moments of frustration, of triumph, of everything that had made up his time at the factory. They had seen something in him, something he hadn't seen in himself. And now, as the quiet park stretched out before him, Jim realized something else. It wasn't just about the factory. It wasn't just about the work. It was about the connections, the relationships, the moments of quiet solidarity. It was about the small things that had built up over the years, the things he had taken for granted, the men who had worked beside him, the friendships that had grown, the little victories and defeats that had shaped his life. But now they were all gone. The factory was closed. His co-workers had moved on, or retired, or passed away. And Jim was left with the quiet, with the memories of a life that had been lived, but was now slipping away. It was a strange feeling, this sense of being in between. He wasn't part of that world anymore, but he wasn't quite sure where he fit in the new world either. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. The world outside had changed, but he wasn't sure he had. Not yet. But that was okay. He had time to figure it out. As Jim sat there, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, he thought about what Mike had said to him on the phone the other day. It had stuck with him, more than he had realized at the time. "You just do your best to make peace with what comes," Mike had said. "You've earned it, man." And maybe that was the key. Maybe it wasn't about figuring everything out all at once. Maybe it was about making peace with what had come, accepting it, and moving forward. Maybe that was enough. Jim stood up slowly, stretching his legs. The day was fading, the air cooling, but he didn't feel the weight of it like he had before. The silence, once so suffocating, now felt like an invitation to step into something new, something he hadn't been able to see until now. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs, and started walking again. The street was quiet, the neighborhood still and peaceful. He didn't know where he was going, but it didn't matter. The letter had given him something. It had given him a sense of purpose, a sense that he wasn't just a man waiting for time to pass. He was a man who had lived, who had made a difference, and that was enough. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his, and that for now was enough. Jim woke up early again, just like he had every day for the last few weeks. But today, there was something different. He felt an energy he hadn't felt since his younger years, something deep within him, as though his body and mind had finally begun to settle into the rhythm of this new life. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was moving in the right direction, and that was enough for him. He had spent the past few days walking the streets, thinking and reflecting, but today he felt ready to do something, ready to move forward, even if it was in small steps. The weight that had been sitting on his chest for so long had lightened, and now it was time to see if he could find meaning in the small, everyday moments of life. The house was still quiet as Jim stood up, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath his feet, the only sound in the early morning. Linda's old coffee mug sat by the sink, its chipped rim a quiet reminder of the woman who had been the center of his life for so many years. He ran his hand over it, his fingers tracing the worn edges, and felt a pang of something. Nostalgia, loss, but also a quiet gratitude for everything they had shared. Today was the day he decided he would make a change. Not a big change, but a change that would help him step out of the shadows of his past and into the light of the present. The factory had defined so much of his life, but it didn't have to anymore, and neither did the silence that had followed Linda's passing. The loneliness had been a constant companion, but Jim wasn't sure it had to be. He dressed slowly, taking his time as he slipped on his jacket and his boots, the familiar motions grounding him. The sun was starting to rise, casting a soft glow across the sky. The neighborhood outside was waking up, people going about their routines, but Jim felt like an observer. A part of him had always been an observer, watching the world go by from the sidelines. But not anymore. He decided to go for a walk. It wasn't a long one, just around the block, but it was something. He had taken walks before, of course, but this time it felt different. The weight in his chest had been replaced by a quiet anticipation, like a door had just opened, and he was stepping through it. As he walked, Jim noticed things he hadn't noticed before. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of leaves crunching beneath his boots, the quiet hum of a car passing by in the distance. It was all so simple, but it felt rich with life, rich with possibility. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking back. He was looking forward, even if just for a moment. He stopped at the park again, the same park he had visited over the past few days. The bench by the swings was empty, just like it had been before, but today it felt different. Today, Jim felt like he had earned his place here. He wasn't waiting for something to happen. He was making something happen. Sitting down, he pulled out the letter once more, this time with a sense of quiet pride. The men who had signed it weren't just co-workers anymore. They were a part of his life, a part of the legacy he had built. He wasn't invisible to them, and he didn't have to be invisible to himself either. Jim read the letter again, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. The words still held the same weight, but now they were more than just a thank you. They were a reminder that his life had mattered, that he had made an impact, even if it had taken him this long to see it. The letter didn't hold the answers to all his questions, and it didn't solve the loneliness he still felt at times, but it had given him something else, a sense of purpose, a reminder that his life was more than just the years he spent working, more than just the routine of the factory. He had been part of something, and that something was enough. Jim folded the letter carefully and placed it back in his jacket pocket. He wasn't sure what the future held. He wasn't sure where he was going next. But for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel so important. What mattered now was that he was moving forward. And that, for today, was enough. He stood up from the bench, the world around him still and quiet, but now full of potential. Jim didn't have all the answers. He didn't even know what he was supposed to do next, but he was ready to find out. He began walking again, the soft sound of his boots on the pavement marking each step. The day ahead was open, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could walk through it, one step at a time. Jim woke up to the same quiet of the morning, but today, the stillness felt different. It wasn't the oppressive silence of the past few weeks, the kind that had weighed him down, made him question everything he thought he knew. No, this silence was lighter, like a blank canvas, waiting for him to paint something new. The weight that had held him for so long had finally begun to lift, and now he was ready to face whatever came next. He stood up from the bed, his movements slow but deliberate. There was no rush today, no pressure, just the day in front of him, stretching out with all its uncertainty and potential. He walked into the kitchen, the soft sound of his feet on the floor echoing in the quiet house. The coffee pot was already set up from the night before, the ritual of brewing his morning cup still intact. But today, even the act of making coffee felt different, less like a routine, more like an invitation to something more. He poured the coffee slowly, watching the dark liquid swirl into the cup. It wasn't just the warmth of the coffee that he felt now. It was the warmth of possibility. Maybe it was the letter. Maybe it was the walks through the park, or the conversations with old co-workers, but something inside him had clicked. He didn't have to have it all figured out. He just had to keep moving. Jim sat at the kitchen table, his fingers wrapped around the mug, his eyes unfocused as he stared out the window. The neighborhood was quiet this morning, the houses bathed in the soft light of dawn. The world was waking up, just like he was. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel left behind. He felt like he was part of it all, like he was a part of something that mattered. He thought about his life, the years at the factory, the time spent raising his children, the quiet moments with Linda that he could still remember so clearly, even though she was gone. It wasn't a perfect life, but it had been a life that mattered. And now, as he sat here in the stillness of the morning, Jim realized something. It wasn't the work that had mattered. It wasn't the factory. It wasn't the hours or the shifts or the paycheck. It was the people, the relationships, the connections he had made over the years, the quiet bonds that had been forged without him even realizing it. Those were the things that mattered, and those were the things he was learning to cherish now. He finished his coffee, the warmth of it spreading through him, and stood up. Today was just another day, another step forward. But it felt different. He felt different. For the first time in a long time, Jim didn't feel like he was waiting for something. He didn't feel like he was trapped in a past that he couldn't escape. He was ready for whatever came next, whatever small adventure lay ahead. The letter was still in his jacket pocket, tucked away where he could always keep it close. It was a reminder of who he had been and who he had yet to become. He had made an impact, however small, and that was enough to give him the courage to keep going. Jim walked outside, the cool air greeting him as he stepped onto the porch. The street was empty, the world still asleep, but Jim felt awake, alive. He wasn't sure where he was headed, but for the first time in a long time, that was okay. The path was his to walk, one step at a time. As he stood there, taking in the quiet of the morning, Jim realized that he wasn't alone. The men from the factory, his co-workers, his family, his memories, those were the things that made him who he was, and he wasn't ready to let go of any of it. He turned toward the road, ready to walk it, whatever it might bring. The future was uncertain, but that wasn't something to fear anymore. It was something to embrace. He walked down the driveway, his boots hitting the pavement with a steady rhythm. And as he moved forward, Jim understood something simple but profound. The journey wasn't over. It had just begun. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.